Great. Dear colleagues, dear students, thank you very much for attending today's lecture on behalf of the School of Modern Languages and Cultures and the School of Chinese. I'm very happy to greet all of you who are in person with us, as well as everyone who's joining us online. My name is Loretta Kim. I'm the current head of school for the School of Modern Languages and Cultures, but more importantly, I'm extremely happy to introduce today's speaker because he has been such an amazing role model and mentor to me over the years. So as you will note, he is Professor Emeritus at Hong Kong Baptist University. And when I joined the history department at HKBU, he immediately took me under his wing and introduced me literally to the world of Sinology and to Christianity in China. And I have carried some of those interests, of course, not to the depth that he has, but forward into my work today. And so I feel that, you know, his career has spanned so many things, but I still look up to him in sinology, in theology, philosophy, and all the things that he pursues, and how to be a polyglot and to appreciate multilingual research. So I'm very delighted to be with him today, of course, and with everyone here, and of course our two core organizers, Professor Song Gang and Professor Legge, to learn more about this research on scaling 5 European Sinological Himalayan peaks. So, Professor Pfister.
Thank you. I will try to stand, and yes, the title is ridiculous, as probably I am nonetheless. But what I do want to do, especially for the students, I can assure you, you will not find these things that I'm talking about online. You know, and why? You will find individual pieces like I've given you already. The students I gave specific kinds of pieces, and there are many more to see. But each of the 5 persons that I'm going to talk about did at least 10 volumes, and sometimes 14. These are massive collections. And it's very hard to find any kind of picture even of the outside of the books, much less something that's dealing with them substantially. And yet these 5 persons are in many ways completely forgotten by most of contemporary academics dealing with Chinese studies. Because why? They're talking about Chinese classics in foreign languages, and most Chinese scholars say, you know, swala, you know, I don't need to know that, you know, I have my own tradition to deal with in my own language, right? And yet these are the people who in at least 5 different languages have, and in the cultures that are associated with them, have influenced the vast majority of study in these realms. And I will explain that in part. So my burden in part is, first of all, just to get you interested. You know, I hope you might find there's something, a lot more in fact, but there's something of interest. Secondly, to argue that they need to be dealt with. So the outline of my lecture shows how ridiculous I am. I am really going to try to say something that's extraordinary and somewhat complex. Because first of all, we may not even know what sinology is, you know, and what is distinctive about it. We have a school of Chinese, but is there a school of sinology? No, no, because this is tied to a certain kind of Anglophone, you know, way of breaking up the academy. It's not a discipline in Anglophone worlds, generally speaking. So I will explain that a bit. And why do these 5 sinologists, because they were dealing with Chinese classics, why are they talked about in this hyphenated word, a word that was created at the beginning of the 21st century to be able to deal with certain kinds of people? Missionary scholars is the English word. In Chinese, we use 传教学者 or 群教学者, you know, using that kind of a technical means to deal with what we're seeing here. And that leads to why some of them are overlooked, because there are various different positions, different, we could say, orientations of life, even ideologies that would say, a missionary? A missionary as a scholar? Aren't these contradictions? You know, literally, that would be some positions, but I will illustrate this in contemporary media. and then move from that to introduce these 5 major figures. Of course, I'm using the Himalayan peaks as a metaphor, but I am trying to say they're so prominent, they're so big. The fact that they aren't even talked about is a shame. And I want to make sure that you get past being shamed. I don't want you to be in that place because I was trained in philosophy, but I was never taught these things. My teachers didn't even know about them in general. They maybe knew of one, not all 5. After I do that, I'm going to explain what I coined the term classics in translation. That's why it's in the quotation marks. Those are not scare quotes or anything else. No, they're meant to say there are some works that when they are translated, they become classics themselves. They are so important in that particular linguistic and cultural realm that they take on the status of classics. And that means essentially that they last for many years. So, for example, one of the texts that I've given out to some students here, and it will be the first person I deal with, James Legge, he lived in Hong Kong and began producing some of his Chinese classics in the 1860s. They're still published in multiple volumes, 160 years later. Now, in my case, if I have a book that's republished once in 5 years, I'm really happy. They haven't forgotten me. I exist in a world that goes beyond my own breath. But this is a person who's been long dead, and yet 160 years later, you can find multiple volumes of this work still being bought and purchased and studied. This is a remarkable achievement. So the Himalayan peaks, I hope you get the image. These really stand out. I'll give some initial comparison because I want you to see across the languages that we're dealing with why they're significant. And particularly we'll see that the first person, the Scottish missionary scholar James Legge, was very formative in this way and is still being referred to now for new ways of interpreting and presenting, what are seen as Chinese classical works. But then I'll go at the end of the lecture into further details, and that's where it might get a little bit more complex and historically much more interesting, and in terms of actual ways in which they did these things, I hope that it will be intriguing even. And I will conclude with some final statements that cover all of these bases. And if all of us last, and I don't fall asleep in my own lecture, we're going to be doing very well. Okay. All right? So, what do we mean by sinology? Now, I must tell you that I, who stand before you, I'm known in Putonghua as Fei Le Ran, and in Cantonese as Fai Lo Yan. Mai Fai Yan. Okay? So, now, I have been categorized as a sinologist, as an overseas sinologist, 海外汉学, 汉学家, and I never studied sinology. I studied philosophy and Chinese philosophy. So why would contemporary scholars in China and others in Europe particularly, why would they consider me to be a 汉学家, a sinologist? Because generally speaking, sinologists are doing interdisciplinary studies. They don't focus on one single discipline. They would do linguistics, history, literature, poetry, maybe, especially if they're dealing with classics. They have to deal with poetic rhyme and other many things that might be in Chinese literature now, or Chinese history, or even Chinese religious studies and Chinese philosophy, but they put them all together. And so even though many European sinologists focus on one area, they would use methods that are influenced by all these different academic disciplines. So overseas sinologists, I will not deal with those that come from East Asian countries, but they're very important, and I'll just mention that at the end again. But you know, such persons in Korea, in Japan, in Vietnam are very formative and have done similar huge works. But I am not competent in that. I'm not able to handle those languages. And so maybe some of you can learn them and introduce them, these key people to us. I will be focusing, as is done now in what we would say contemporary Chinese studies, where we have a good number of journals in Chinese on Hanxue, you know, Guoji Hanxue, Jindai Hanxue, you know, there's a whole range of things, and sometimes overlapped with Guoxue, you know. So national studies and what would be seen as studies of China are linked in these academic realms. And this is what I'm going to present to you as the major contributions to sinology that are ironically overlooked. Now, these 5 sinologists, I've mentioned them it is seen on the poster, but I will introduce you by name and by background and that. Let me just say, all of them, and quite astoundingly, all of them were missionaries. 3 of them were Jesuits. And the Jesuit order on the Roman Catholic side has had quite an astounding academic, you know, standard of life that they require of every single one of their people. 2 others were Protestants. The first is a Scottish person who lived here in Hong Kong for 30-some years, James Legge. The second that I'll deal with is an Italian Jesuit who lived in Shanghai in what is now called Shujiahui, you know, and it was technically a compound for Italian, primarily Italian Jesuits. And they taught children who were, you know, they were Roman Catholic Chinese children. They taught them not only normal, what we might see as normal classes in mathematics, arts, and other things, but also in Latin. And he was a Latin specialist in both theological and philosophical ways. The third person, Seraphine Couvreur, is a person who lived in the southern part of Hebei province in what is called Hejianfu. It's still there, you know, still present. The large compound that they had was, once again, dedicated primarily to French Jesuits. So as some of the, even in the 1930s, some of the people who lived there said, oh, you enter here and you, outside the walls, you are in China. Inside the walls, you've entered into Paris. You know, it literally, you know, it was culturally that distinct because they were promoting a certain way. This was the teacher of seminarians. Couvreur taught those who wanted to become Roman Catholic priests. And so, yes, he was very competent, also in Latin, but he wanted to make it more popular. So the texts that he translated in 2 languages, in what would be seen as Church Latin, and the second in popular French. And these, again, as I've suggested, they're still available. You can still go to Paris and find them, you know, and they're published in different editions, but very, very influential. The fourth person is a Protestant again, but German, Richard Wilhelm, you know, and Wilhelm grew in his sinological awareness in a colony, like here. The British colony opened the door toward James Legge, and the German colony of Jiaozhou, which is now Qingdao, you know, opened the door toward German missionaries, and Richard Wilhelm was one among the first to be there. Became very enamored with what he saw as the Ru and Taoist traditions, and began publishing these texts, and was thinking very much of the precedents that particularly James Legge had set up. So you see, there's not just an arbitrariness in what I'm dealing with here too, but some of these people inspired others, as I hope I would even dare to think that I might inspire someone here, to do something that would be remarkable as these people did. The final person was in the 20th century, and I include him because he did very self-consciously followed both James Legge and Seraphine Couvreur. He cites them constantly in his notes, and he was a Portuguese, and he grew up in Macau. And I say grew up because he actually wanted to learn Chinese language and was very eager to gain some kind of cultural vantage point as a Jesuit and to be able to promote Roman Catholic traditions and worldviews and life in a Portuguese setting. And so at age 18, he went to Macau in 1926, which is very early and in a very complicated period, and he served as a missionary. So even on the volume that I will show some of you that are here, it says it is published by a press called the Portuguese Jesuits, and he names himself as a missionary in a particular city in Guangdong. Even though he's clearly seeking to do something very scholarly and quite complex. Okay, so these missionary scholars almost always created, they clearly created classics in translation in the languages they were involved with: English, Latin, French, German, and Portuguese. Okay? There are still the standards. There may have been some other new translations on certain texts, but they are the standards that people go to. And they served at some point, some of them served as university professors. James Legge went to Oxford. He was the first professor of Chinese language and literature, Corpus Christi College in Oxford. And that position still exists and is still filled and is identified with his origins. The second one that was clear because the Jesuits tended to go someplace, live and die there, and they did, and they served well. It meant that their materials were adopted in universities, but they did not normally take up a position in a university. Richard Wilhelm from Qingdao left there, did a few years as a special cultural, we could say, consultant to a new German ambassador in Beijing for 1922 to 24, and then was hired to become the first Chinese professor at Frankfurt University, a new university in Germany. And that's, again, that position still exists and has now, the university itself has gone through its centennial, so it's not that old of a university, but it has been particularly important with regard to sinology and Wilhelm's influence. Interestingly, unlike the other Jesuits I mentioned, and due to the kinds of complexities of the 20th century that shaped contemporary China, to make it a post-traditional and post-revolutionary society. Joachim Guerra served first as a missionary, was actually kicked out of China and even threatened to be executed. He survived, and that was a story that was extremely traumatic for him. But then he went back to Portugal, served in one university there, and then began to envision doing this work that he knew would be incredibly intensive and very big. And he managed to do the same number of translations that James Legge did, 14 volumes. He managed to do it from 1979 to 1988 in 9 years. But he had started early, so the first publication was again, extraordinary, but very much an influence, especially in Lusophone. I don't know if you know that word, Portuguese, influenced societies. And I know that Dr. Cabral, you are here. He is one of these who has just finished his PhD on Mr. Guerra. And so I'm particularly grateful that we can share something more about that. Why do these persons count? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but those of you who want the PPT, I will give it to you. You know, I'm willing to share this so that you can do it. The point of my going this route, I'm citing one of the two most informative books on the study of Christianity in China. This is the second one by R.G. Tiedemann, who passed away in 2019, a German historian of Shandong, particularly Shandong province, and a brilliant, brilliant historian. This book is over 1,000 pages, you know, but he documents the fact that among all the missionaries that had been in the Chinese, you know, context from the 15th century all the way up through the 20th century, literally to 2000, the year 2000, there are something like 26 nations represented. There were over 13,000 persons, and one other Scottish scholar of missiology, Andrew Wall, says normally people who went onto the mission field, about 1% would produce something that was published and would have some influence in their own linguistic side. And he said in the case of China, it was so demanding that probably 2%. But that means there were something like 260, maybe, as many as 260 missionary scholars. I've identified over 50, but that just says to me that it's not impossible to find many others. There's many, because many of them are in our archival works. They did publish things, but we no longer use them because the China they lived in no longer exists. It was transformed through 2 revolutions. So the people we're dealing with, intriguingly, in my mind, are only from, you know, essentially 5 different cultures, but they were unique in their own abilities, in their own ways. I give you more about this from Roman Catholic and Protestant, but I will go to beyond. I even tell you exactly the names, but we have literally only 5 countries that produced these extraordinary people. That's to say why I refer to them in this metaphor of the Himalayan, the Sinological Himalayan. There were many others who published works, many others who did sinologically important works, but these are the ones that produce the classics in translation. And that's why they're so important. It's also why it's such a shame that we have things happen where they're completely ignored. Now, most recently, this is from a very good, he's a scholar, you know, journalist, you know, Huang Shaofeng. He got his MA in philosophy from Huadong Shifan Daxue. A very solid, you know, philosophy degree in contemporary China. And he was writing on one of the sinologists from the academy, the French Academy. Chauvin was not a person who had missionary background, you know, and I think this influenced him. And it's a very, very long article. It's very interesting. It's informative in many ways. But in the midst of it, he gives a kind of summary of sinology. He says, what we count as sinology when we get to the 19th century was thoroughly secularized. And as you see, my response is quite straightforward. Yeah, absolutely wrong. Yeah, false. Yeah, and why? Even in the French world, what is remarkable is the person, Séraphin Couvreur, you know, was so astounding that he received a prize for sinological production, for achievements, 3 times. Stanislas Julien was one of the earlier, you know, members of the academy in France, and after he died, he put a bursary, a bunch of money aside, so that this award could be given to those who produced the most outstanding work in any year. The first year, 1876, who received the prize? James Legge, for his work on the Chinese classics. The first of these that I mentioned, and two of the books are out already. And feel free to share it with others, because I want you to see them, we see images of pages, but we don't see the books themselves, and they're important to understand. Couvreur is the only person since 1876 who's received the Stanislas Julien Prize 3 times. No one else has ever had that happen. It's extremely rare. Now, this is 150 years of annual prizes, almost completely, except for during wars when it was a little bit harder. I don't recall anyone that got it twice. There may be 1 or 2. No one has ever received the prize 3 times. And yet, Seraphim Couvreur lived his life in Hebei, died there. His grave is there. His grave was even uprooted by the Red Guard, and they pieced together only parts of his gravesite, because there were dozens of others that were there. But he produced works that his own colleagues at that time in 19th century France considered were the best works in 3 different years of all sinological productions. Now, is this not important? And yet, Mr. Huang doesn't know that this person even existed. Why is that? I think we could say quite straightforwardly that in contemporary China, under revolutionary ideology and current ideologies that would see religious people as somewhat problematic, if not completely crazy, like the Taiping Rebellion, these guys were just destructive and, get rid of them, And it is the case that teachers, generations of teachers, never saw these. But the other thing that makes a lot more sense, especially for someone like Professor Song, who's here, in the School of Chinese, why would you want to study a Portuguese translation of the Shi Jing? I mean, you say, isn't that a little bit too much? We have so many commentators on the Shi Jing already, and from the Han all the way through to the Qing. Why do I have to do that? And I think that's reasonable. It's just that sometimes we miss what is obvious. It's sort of like an invisible elephant who's making a mess in your room, and you can't figure out what's going on, because when you go into Portuguese realms, they don't know the Chinese, but they know the teachings of Master Kong and the 4 books and that because of Mr. Guerra. And this is, I think, what happened here also, that Mr. Huang is a very competent person. He's very informed, but he assumed that because Mr. Chauvin was not a missionary, that there really wasn't any significant missionary in the Francophone world. It's just false, unfortunately. It's not true. Right? So this is an example of contemporary Chinese, and it's in the Pengpang, right? Pengpang Xinwen. This is a major, social media event. His text is something like 20,000 characters. This is no small thing. It's a huge text. So when you have someone producing such a substantial thing and making such a overgeneralization that is in fact historically wrong, I just feel an obligation to say, no, wait, we're missing something, and it's not small. It's not small. Another that is a little bit closer to home here, 2015, Chinese University Press, very good colleagues, Lawrence Wong, fantastic, translation scholar, and we have our own, Professor Lai here, who's representing that tradition and that school, and we've known each other so long. I'm so grateful we're here, but still we have colleagues, and Bernhard Führer is from Austria, you know. And they produced a work called Sinologists as Translators in the 17th to 19th century. Now, I understand that, you know, sinologists, I just told you what they are, right? You know, and translators, yes, we've been talking about them, right? You know, they're translating all these books, right? All of them, at minimum 10, okay? So you would expect, at least I would, I see that title and I say, oh, good. He's going to be talking about, you know, and I name the figures, yeah. They're not even appearing in the index. I couldn't even find a single reference to any of them, you know. And I just think, wait. There's something wrong here. There's something wrong, you know. And it's not because they didn't have, they and many other colleges didn't have things to talk about. They did, but they're missing the most obvious. And here I think it's another kind of problem. And it happened with my own Chinese teacher. You know, my Chinese teacher, Cheng Zhongying, recently passed away this year, July 2nd. But when I took James Legge's works to him, he said, oh, yes, I use it all the time. Who is he? And so on the basis of that, literally, he said, I use it and I find it to be quite reliable, especially because if I want to get a proper translation in Chinese, and I say, most of the time he's, you know, sometimes I disagree, but most of the time he's competent, you know. But I have no idea who this guy is, you know. So I used a metaphor. He's an intellectual black hole. Everyone knows it exists, but they have no idea what this thing is, you know, and it kind of sucks up everything, you know. And I think that's really a problem for many contemporary sinologists. These 5 figures have produced so much work. It's a very substantial effort. It takes a huge amount of work to get a comprehensive vision of what they're doing. And so if they refer to them, they might just refer to one of the texts in the midst of, say, 10 volumes, you know, but they don't really know how they are linked together and what they are. I see that as an important problem. It's significant, you know, and that's probably why, you know, one of my kind, you know, colleague said, Pfister, you keep doing things that look like suicidal missions, you know, you try to take these big things and make sense of them, you know, and none of us would ever waste our time doing that, you know, and I tell you, it's not been a waste. It's been worth it. But it does mean that sometimes what we have is what seem to be standard accounts of overviews of various situations miss the most obvious translators. And again, I simply offer it to you because I feel the burden of correcting a little bit of a misguided judgment. Okay, so who are these 5? And here I may be using words, and students and colleagues, if you don't understand some of these words, please feel free to ask more. I'm going to try to reveal them to you. But James Legge was a Scottish Congregationalist. That's one of those big words. You know, what is that? You know, he represented the London Missionary Society here in Hong Kong, became a senior, you know, the senior representative. He helped found the church that is called Union Church now on Kennedy Road. It still exists, you know. And then after he was here in Hong Kong, and had served a few more years to finish his Chinese classics, these big books that I've shown to some of you. And please feel free, as I say, please feel free to share them, because I will take them away from you in a moment and try to show other people what they are. So share them with anyone who hasn't seen them. He then was invited, and I want to say this to honor the cleverness of Hong Kong people. You know? He was so honored, and he so respected common Chinese people and people of all status in the British colony that just about 100 Hong Kong businessmen and others, including former students of his, put together a very large sum of money And they went to Oxford and said, if you will hire him, we will give you this money. Notice they didn't say, we give you this money, will you hire him? No, 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 they're too clever for that. They said, if you will hire this man, then we will give you the, and that's what happened. And that's not the only gift, by the way. The other gift is at the Albert and Victoria Museum, and it's an astounding silver plaque. The equivalent of it that a recent art historian has, who's from Guangdong, by the way, she gave a lecture on it last year, and the equivalent is, the only thing they found that was equivalent was a gift given to the Empress Catherine in Russia by the Qing Empire. That's how precious James Legge was to the Hong Kong community. So there is something more to find here. And hopefully that plaque, by the way, may be visiting Hong Kong for a few years, so you'll be able to see it. The second is a person very little known. Angelo Zottoli did this work. Now, who has the Latin version I gave? Did I give it? No. Yes, it was to my colleague, John. Here, just to pass it around, Angelo Zottoli did 5 volumes of this, what he called a course in Chinese literature. Incredible. In it were, he did much more than just the classics, but he did also substantial portions, some of them whole books, some of them selection. And he did it in classical Latin. So you have Chinese Latin, just as you have with Legge, and I will show you later images of this, where Legge had Chinese and his English translation, the Chinese standard text, and then notes. Zottoli didn't have notes, but he had a huge amount of literature. And so one of the colleagues here at Hong Kong U, now back in the US and Arizona, Nick Morrow, has really shown that this is a tremendous resource for literature, and he was using it to train what would be future Roman Catholic Chinese priests, and also other foreign priests who came through the Shanghai area and were trained by him. A very remarkable and gifted person. Seraphim Couvreur, I've referred to already in this extraordinary three times that he was honored with the Stanislas Julien Prize, but he lived in Hejianpu all his life, was a very quiet, it's very hard to find even pictures of some of these people because they weren't self-aggrandizing, There were missionaries who were, but they were, these two, Zottoli and Couvreur, were remarkable, humble, very gifted, and very committed to the work that they did. And Couvreur has produced. There is an error that says he produced a dictionary. That was one of the classical Chinese-French dictionary that was one of the prizes that he earned. It is said that he produced a translation or transcription system that was used by the French government. No, that's not quite right. It was similar, but it was not his. Still, his influence was absolutely remarkable. And as I said, you can go to Paris now and still find his texts in stores that are related to the Oriental, world. Richard Wilhelm is another unusual figure, and you notice I have 2 family names. There's a reason behind that. It is not arbitrary, but I will address that later. He was a German Lutheran, and after being in Shandong province to 1920, he then returned to Germany and then became subsequently, a few years later, a professor at the University of Frankfurt am Main, the first professor of Chinese. I'm not quite sure if it was Chinese culture or what the title was exactly, but the China Institute, as it was called, was a major event. Now, if you catch the years, and students, I want you to be aware of this, the German colony of Qingdao, of Jiaozhou, existed from 1898. and he got there in 1899. So yes, he was very much in a colonial context, and Qingdao was one of those places where you go to certain parts of it and it's like you're in Germany, because the buildings that were built by German architects there were destroyed in World War II by bombing. You know, it's a beautiful place in many ways, but he was there during World War I, and he was a pacifist. And so this sets up another set of things and may explain, at least in part, why he was also someone drawn to Taoist traditions. And quite an unusual, in this way, quite an unusual, figure. The last, I've talked about the Portuguese and his presence. Joachim, I don't know if you know Spanish or Portuguese. Anyone here know Spanish? Yeah, Guerra. What does Guerra mean?
War.
Yes, thank you. War. And notice his Chinese name is for a spear. So he followed this, and his character was pretty unusual, But he was an astounding Jesuit person with a lot of intensity, and yet also has produced this huge amount of work. He did serve, like Legge, for over 20 years in Macau and Guangdong, and then taught in one of the universities, the Technical University of Lisbon. So I want to say, let us not forget these people, please. More. Let's try to understand them. And that's the purpose of what I'm going to do now. Okay? Yes, this is a very difficult thing to see. But I want to describe it. I won't do it in detail, but I want you to see. I created this in an article and put it at the end of an article that I published in 2015 on Joachim Guerra, to say, why is Legge and Guerra, why would they be considered these remarkable, sinological scholars? Because here I have on this side all these small Chinese characters that some of you, even here in this room, cannot even imagine what they are. 论语、大学、中庸、孟子、易经、书经 or 尚书、诗经、礼记、春秋、左传、义理、孝经. All of them, except for the Ili in Legge's case, all of them translated into English and given commentarial notes. All of them, including the Ili, but not the I Ching, by Couvreur. Most of them by Zottoli, but not as many. He did portions of them. Richard Wilhelm was much more selective. Joachim Guerra, all of them again. These are simply remarkable, and they were not always just one edition, sometimes two, or revised, even a third time. Amazingly so. Now, again, if you want the PPT, I give it to you because I'm not going to spend too much time on that. It's a lot to say. Here are images we republished with Huadongshi Fandashe Chubanshe in 2010, the Chinese classics, at the gracious effort of that university press. They published this 800 sets, and in 18 months they were sold out. So it's not only in other parts of the world that James Legge has had an influence, but his work is seen as extraordinary. And these are Chinese-English multilingual texts on every page. Those of you who've seen now, every single page, remarkable. He prepared them with moving script. They created the metal script that were used in the Anglo-Chinese College here in Hong Kong. It was created here. Quite extraordinary, And then the last 6 volumes that he did, there's some overlap, but these were part of a much bigger series called The Sacred Books of the East. And Legge produced the most of any one single author. 6 volumes. There were teams that produced 5, in the Sacred Books of the East, but for other cultural settings. He did all in both what he called Confucian or Ru traditions, 4 volumes, and 2 in Taoist traditions. Again, quite extraordinary. The difference is that there was very little Chinese, and the standard Chinese text was not in them, primarily because when they were published in Oxford, they didn't have access to the technologies that Legge had access to while he was here in Hong Kong. Okay. So, what do we know more generally? And here, yes, 320, that's terrible. Okay, I'm going to, I want to ask questions, so I will try to do this quickly. Legge's translations were influenced by a very strong biblical commitment. And he was part of the generation of Chinese missionaries, that is, foreign missionaries to China. In that case, it was the Qing dynasty, who were making the biblical text available. They translated it in a number of different ways. He was part of what is called a nonconformist tradition. That means that in the UK, or at that time Great Britain, if you didn't belong to the Anglican Church, so Sengongwei, why do you have Sengongwei? Here in Hong Kong, it was because it was the government-sponsored text. So underneath the governor, the third person in authority was the bishop of Hong Kong. Legge was not part of that. He opposed that. He stood in opposition to that. That said that he had a kind of hermeneutic dissonance with his own, cultural background on the one hand, the Anglophone side, and this opened him into possibilities of other ways of looking at Chinese settings in the Ru tradition particularly, that also provided alternatives, including alternatives to militarism that he criticized in his first volume, 1861. British militarism he criticized as opposed to what Master Kong, Konghuzi, offered as renzheng, humane government. Quite an amazing tact. Many persons, contemporary persons, wouldn't anticipate that a missionary of this sort would stand against his own people and his own government at certain points, but he did so because he had biblical reasons and theological reasons for doing so. Now, Wilhelm was the other Protestant, and as a Lutheran, he was part of the state church. So he had a very different position. What made him different was that he was a pacifist, and that his orientation was deeply influenced by this father-in-law, Christoph Bohmhardt, who actually had a political voice, and created a political party in that period of time. So his situation was more complex. Now, I want to go through all this, but you must bear with me. I want to get to some other neat stuff, okay? Now, this is actually part of the committee of those who produced the Hohebun, the Bible. These missionaries, and Legge and Wilhelm, were very much aware of these things. Missionaries worked with their Chinese Christian colleagues. They had them seated in between them, because they did not do this alone. And this is true. This is another side of what we need to deal with these missionary scholars who produce these vast areas. Who were they getting their information from? Who helped them in the difficult parts? I'm not going to deal with that, but I do want to get to some other things. Here, again, I urge you to take up the PPTs. This is Wilhelm's corpus. Not all of it, but some of it, And here, this volume, the I Ching, you can kind of see it there. He divided into 3 books, a very creative, almost like a Jushi, dividing up and reorganizing Dashui. I take that to be a very suitable parallel. But you can see he created very elegant works. They were aesthetically very pleasing. And he saw that as one of the values of Ren. It had what in Germany called Schönheit. It has beauty in it. And he wanted to demonstrate that even in the way he published the text. You don't always see that online. Hmm? You wouldn't see even the outsides, but I'll try to show you a little bit more. The issues the hermeneutic concerns that tied to the Jesuits are more complex, partly because they had a special book besides the scriptures and their traditions. They had a special book called the Spiritual Exercises that affected every single one of them. The Jesuit order is separated into different provinces, normally on the basis of languages, but in the case of France, for example, they had 4 provinces in France because they had so many Jesuits from there. And every year, they would commit a full month to the spiritual exercises, meditating on the approach to the crucifixion that Jesus had, meditating on him, seeking to share in that suffering and being motivated to serve, believing that he conquered death and that he was resurrected. So, but the spiritual exercises doesn't go to the resurrection. It wants you to work through the suffering so that you'll be willing to serve more, as they say, for the greater glory of God. These were people that were very highly motivated and often extremely well educated. These are 3 of the volumes of Couvreur, including his dictionary for which he received one of the prizes. But you see that he identifies himself with this French transcription of Guerra. He never was in other parts of Europe. He spent his life here. These militancies ended up causing some friction. So the Shanghai Italian Jesuits were in competition with the Hujianfu French Jesuits, and they were very self-conscious of this and had their own presses, and they had their own ways of trying to deal with things. That's another part of the kind of spiritual thing. But many of you may not know that because of specific kind of independence of Jesuit orders, they were disbanded by a pope. Their highest official, the person they count as the most authoritative in their own tradition, disbanded them in 1773. So you're too dangerous. You threaten our order. You threaten the establishment that we have as Roman Catholics. And this lasted for nearly 50 years. So that only in 1814 were they reestablished, but as a consequence, many of the places where Jesuits had been and where Jesuits left were handed over to other orders until they returned in the late 1840s. This was a very messy kind of thing. Very messy. But it did happen. Oops, not yet. I'll stay there, okay? It did happen, and so it's a matter that should be understood because Angelo Zottoli and Seraphim Couvreur were part of the new or modern Jesuit order. They came back saying, we will submit to the Pope, but we're still Jesuits. So they still could fight with each other over competition on serving the Lord the best way, But quite amazing. Now, why did I go back? Because this is James Legge. These are images. There are many other images of him, but this is an image that was a painting of him before he left, literally months before he left for what was then Malacca, in the Malay Peninsula, when he was 26 years old. Okay? And this is James Legge. He received 3 honorary doctorates. Not 1, not 2, but 3. 1 from the US and 2 from Scotland. And this is at the time when the University of Edinburgh gave him his doctorate in 1884. Quite remarkable in his own right. And yet many Scots people don't even know his name, okay? Unfortunately. What I do here is try to show the depths of his training. Unlike most missionaries who came from other countries, the 26 countries, James Legge had 2 earned master's degrees. Many of them didn't even have 1, okay? So he saw himself as being ready to engage the elite culture of the Qing dynasty. That's why he had in his mind, I want to get to these classics. You know, he was so good in Latin and Greek, he could translate between them. You give him a Greek text, he would translate into Latin. Give him a Latin, he'd translate into Greek. And he'd check it by seeing, by not looking at the Greek originally and then going back and saying, no, did I do it right? Amazingly. And that's what prepared him for translating from Chinese and many different forms of Chinese across the dynastic commentarial tradition into English. He was the principal of the Anglo-Chinese College. That's where the press was. But well, I think what's really important is that he saw, when he looked at the Shangshu and the oldest passages in the Shijing, he saw the term di and tian and sometimes shangdi. And he said, this is deity. It's treated that way, particularly in later commentaries and in the what was called the Great Qing Ritual Order, Da Qing Hui Dian. There, they specifically said Shangdi was not an ancestor, but was the ultimate being in the universe. And he cites this to say, you know, actually in Ru traditions, there are ancient theists. And I like that because I'm a missionary and I'm a theist, you know, but of a special sort. And so this became quite extraordinary in the ways that he dealt with things. You see, he did these two texts, and I wanted to be sure, is the text there? Oh, may I simply do this, okay? Because some of you haven't seen it, okay? That's what you see on every opening, okay? The upper text in Chinese was what he did at the Anglo-Chinese press, in Chinese, with Huang Sheng, the person that was there. And then beneath is his translation. And at the very bottom are extended notes. Legge referred to over 300 Ru commentators, either by their name or the works. Over 300 in the whole of the 5 volumes. Now, most of us, if we handle, you know, it's now becoming popular in certain places like Hackett Publishing. They say, now we'll do the Lunyu and you'll cite 5 different commentators. And they say, this is really impressive, you know. And it is, especially because they're probably notable persons. Legge cited majority, the ones that he cited most were probably about 40. But there were another 260. And he did all that work without a computer, no online stuff, you know, no vocal translation, you know. No, he did this from 3 to 8 in the morning. He got up, went to bed early, and got up early. That's how he did it. So you see, this is what I was describing. For those of you that are online, you could see that. Okay. There are other matters. His bilingual texts were very richly presented in the Chinese classics, but unfortunately, as I said, they couldn't be persisted. That form of bilingualism couldn't be continued in the sacred books of China. Nevertheless, he took Master Kong to be someone who had a theism behind him. That's still an issue today, but it's debated. Some traditionalists say, yes, of course, you know, Shen Wang and others, these were theists, but we haven't been that. We don't have to be that. You know, so there's some debate about what is the contemporary Ru religious sentimentality. Now, having done that, you can imagine that there's a lot more to talk about, okay? Legge becomes the standard in how he set the format, and how he presented the questions, and what he dealt with regard to the cultural rituals that are all part of the classical Ru tradition. Zottoli was also among them. And Legge only became, because Zottoli completed his works from 1879 to 1882. Legge was completing his Legge at the time, and he had finished most of it, and then someone had sent him a copy of Zottoli. And he said, oh, the spirit of Matteo Ricci. Yeah. His Latin was so good. He said, I'm very impressed. But Zottoli didn't do the whole of the Legge. He only focused on those sections, the books that were dealing with sacrifices. Because for a Roman Catholic, the sacrifice of Jesus is the core spiritual matter that is central to everything you consider. And so you can see the selectivity, in the selectivity itself, a spiritual hermeneutic that was at work. This very good book by Antonio De Caro, who did his PhD at Baptist University, by the way. Yes, Lo Bingchang, who's again a very, very fine Christian philosopher and Christian intellectual. This is now available, so you can learn something more about how he integrates this. Many of the Jesuits also had a Marian tradition. That is a kind of softer spirituality that was influenced by the mother of Jesus. And all of them had specific elements of that, but Guerra was particularly, informed, and I'll try to deal with that just in a little bit. I'm over the time I want. Sorry, I'm sorry. Oh, dear me. Okay, here we go. Now, this is Couvreur. Now, what I want you to see is they don't just copy each other. They had some creativity, and the Couvreur that I have, yes, I have to show you. This is a good one. This is Zhuan, okay? Very nice text. We got some very nice copies at Baptist U. What you have initially, when he did the Lunyu, he only did the text and maybe the commentary from Zhu Xi, because that was the authorized commentary. Okay? But then he gave transliteration for every single character, transcripted, in his own transcription, then Latin translation and French for 12. Yeah, he didn't do it for all, fortunately. In the ones that were big, like the Legge and the Zhuan, he only gave a French. But he gave footnotes. He gave footnotes, which he didn't have here. Such a work. What discipline. What discipline, I tell you. There's so much to be learned by studying these and taking them to task. And as I say, even though now Antung and others from the Academy and other sinologists in France have now produced a very rich, over what I knew in the past was already 50 volumes of translations, some of them being these that Couvreur has done, some being new, still his works are available in Paris. You can still get them. So Couvreur, who was he? He followed Legge's example, but only the I Ching he didn't do. There was already a Latin version of it, and he said, I don't have to do that. It's too difficult, And so he gave the I Li, which was a semi-canonical work, and no one else has done that in other of these European languages. This is wrong, because it should be 1895 and not 1985. I'm very sorry, I just see it now. Okay, sorry. I tried to get through that, but he did his first set of Les Quatre Livres, the 4 books, in 1895. And then from that moved all the way up to 1916, when he completed the last and the longest, the Zhuan. He had initially only used Zhu Xi, but later, in his later works that you saw the footnotes, he was using Kongying Da of the Tang and Zheng Xuan of the Han and Zhu Xi. These were the 3 main figures of the Song. He didn't refer to Qing scholars, where Legge did, and tended to prefer them. So now, let's see, what do I have? Why is that there? Okay. I want to see, is there anything else I needed to say? Dasha, yes, this is quite an important issue. Some of you may not know that in the 4 books, the Dashui and Zhongyong that we have as the standard 4 books are reconceived by Zhu Xi. They are reordered. The Dashui is radically reordered, and one section of it, the 5th commentary, didn't exist, and so Zhu Xi dared to add his own commentary. And as a result, it became a major conflict within Ru traditions, the difference between Li Xue and Xin Xue, Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming. That's the key. Wang Yangming writes, Da Xue 1, Dai Hok Man, he had a lot of, and there is even in Taiwan and Academia Sinica, between the Song and the Ming, there were 42 different versions of the Da Xue text. That's how complicated this is. So, Couvreur and Legge both produced the new text, Xinban, which is Zhu Xi's, as well as the old text in the Legge, not changing it so that those who wanted to know about the problem would be able to follow them, even if they didn't know Chinese. They could follow it through seeing the emphases of the text. That's a big issue that some people would avoid. I was never even taught the problem as a philosopher. And you'd think the 4 books was really important in Ru tradition. They wouldn't, my teachers wouldn't even touch them. It was too complex, So they were way ahead of the game in that regard. This is Richard Wilhelm in the 1920s. And the one thing I just want to say is he was deeply inspired, and I want you to see this if you can. Those of you online, I can't help you. I'm so sorry. But what he did in his version of the Lunyu, he produced 2 translations. One was what he called literal, and the other was modern. Why did he do this? He produced it in 1910, as there were Chinese revolutionaries fighting against the Manchurian. And he was aware that there was a deep question about the relevance of Ru traditions in that part of the world. Yes, please. And so he had spoken to a person who is now known historically as quite an astounding traditionalist, Gu Hongming, who was from Malaysia, but ethnically Chinese, and a fine translator. He had learned German well enough to translate these texts into German, and then also did some in English. And as an older man, Gu was really emphasizing to Wilhelm in the German colony, you've got to make these relevant. Don't just translate them as if they're museum pieces. Bring relevance. So he would talk about Goethe and Kant and the impact of other contemporary philosophers and religious persons, on how the text was being presented in German. Very remarkable in this way. But he suffered a lot from the wars. He didn't want to support them. He was very upset that the Lutheran tradition in Germany supported war and caused the deaths of so many. And so after he had spent some time in Qingdao, he then ultimately returned with a deeper commitment to Taoist traditions. So unlike Legge only dealt with Taoism at the very end of his life in the Sacred Books of China. The second book that Wilhelm translated was Tao Te Ching. The third, Liez, which again, in French and German traditions, they do Zhuangzi, Liezi, and Tao Te Ching. In my own Anglophone, we only had Zhuangzi and Tao Te Ching. He was very, very much engaged. And then the whole of the Lu Shi Chuan Chou, which is a huge volume, again, very mixed from a variety of different perspectives. He was deeply engaged with life-giving forms and opposed to technological means of destructive life. And this shaped him profoundly. As a consequence, when he did his I Ching, which is clearly the most influential text, by the way, Of all the texts that were translated that I'm referring to now, the I Ching of Richard Wilhelm has been retranslated in more other languages, not from Chinese, but from the German, okay, into English, and I've seen 13 other languages. Why? Because he tried to make it relevant. Now, there's a problem with that, but I won't discuss the relevance problem here. I have notes in the bibliography if you're interested. But what I do want to do is just point out something that some of you may not have seen. These are the front pages that he also put in his German translations. So he not only translated Chinese text into German, but he translated his title page into Chinese. And so if you follow this, you see he's now referring to Qingdao, right? But notice his family name. You remember I told you that was a question, yeah? Well, this is Legge, 1911. Mengzi, 1913-14. Well, this Wei, it doesn't really have much meaning. 1924, Wei. Why this Wei? Wei Hu the Wei. He's protecting what he counts to be traditional Chinese wisdom. And he wants to be seen who did that. Changed his name as he dealt with the book of changes. That's not ironic, it's not unself-conscious, it's very conscious. Saying that, yes, these missionary scholars, as sinologists, could also be transformed. And they were. They became people who cared about and were concerned for and advocated things that many of the people in their own cultures wouldn't even listen to. And so it was with Guerra. And he suffered, I mentioned he went through the traumatic experience of even, he was told he would be executed, and then in the end, people advocated for him, and he managed to escape from where he was. But it was a very traumatic experience, part of the second revolution in China. And as a result, he went back, taught at the Technical University of Lisbon, and it was while he was there that he then had this vision. I could do better than Legge and Couvreur. Yeah, sure. Yeah, but he had the vision, you know? I mean, some of us are, you know, we're motivated by a lot of things, and that he was motivated by that. His name was War, and he was bellicose, you know, I can do better than Legge and Couvreur. And he criticized, but he always referred to Legge as my master, Mestre Legge. He saw him as the greatest of sinologists. And it's intriguing to read. But the one thing I want to show you as a kind of illustration of this, and here I go to Sister Loretta first, and I'll give this. This is called, literally, you can see if I read it, Quadra Volume de Confucio, you know, the 4 volumes of Confucius. Now that sounds like the 4 books, right? It's not. It's of Confucius. Mengzi is not there. He added the Xiaojing instead. And so he was creating his own tradition with Confucius as a kind of religious prophet, very much influenced by Vatican II openness to other religious traditions. And so quite intriguing. But precisely in the light of that, then Guerra considered Zhuxi and Xunzi, these two, as heretics, because Xunzi had Fei Tianlun, you know, he was against there being any heavenly power that was truly, you know, theistic, you know, and he felt Zhuxi had followed that too closely. There are books, and I can't go to too much detail because you should shoot me if I continue to talk too much more. I want to talk to you and hear your questions. So here I will just come to the conclusion. And again, let me just say, if you're interested, the PPT can be obtained. These 5 major missionary scholars have complicated hermeneutic traditions. Jesuit, German Lutheran, Scottish Congregationalists. They were committed scholars. They were very educated, you know, but they had some possessions, especially in the metaphysics, that would probably cause us to question, but they found common sources of wisdom and practices that they felt were life-giving, and they wanted these to be known. All of them produced these long-lasting classics in translation. The reason I can present them to you now is because they're available. But sadly, even Hong Kong University Library doesn't have all of them, you know? So not all libraries are comprehensive. Not all online sources are comprehensive. Beware, beware, you 21st century online addicts. Sinologically speaking, these scholars published their translations only after they had taught and studied the text for 20 years. Only Richard Wilhelm dared to do it after he'd studied it only 10. They were pretty competent. All of them produced translations on reading the commentaries, but Legge was by far the most thoroughly read. He was astounding. The more I have studied him, the more I am overwhelmed. You know, I am convinced that he knew 10 times as much as I do. And that is not hyperbolic. It is literal. I could never even come close. Zottoli's had very few notes. Couvreur only had them in the latter part. And Guerra did not refer to Chinese commentators almost always. He fought Legge and Couvreur to the end of his days. and it's interesting, you know. He had some reasons for doing so, but it shows the quality of the text and the complexities of them that deserve our attention, okay? I've given you this, but you know, yeah, most often I just want to say thanks for bearing with. No one fell asleep. I'm really happy. Thank you so much. Okay.
We have two moderators.
Okay.
Zottoli,
I will let
you
you
go
do
first.
it. Yes, please.
This wonderful lecture. I think you used very nice metaphor, right? The metaphoric expression, the Himalayan peaks. Yeah, for these really 5 special missionary scholars, or you call sinologists, translators, all these, really, they have multiple identities. And meanwhile, religious background or service for the foreign government. So really, these figures and their works are so special, and you just get really, you lead us to, to read these, translators and their works, really from. I think there's a good way really to compare them, their background and their understanding of the Ruist tradition, and also some parts, for the translation practices. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So I really appreciate, this. I think, from my limited knowledge, I think scholars, they could do, the works by James Legge. I mean, maybe most of scholars, doing the research on James Legge, but for others, maybe not that many. And put them all 5 together. Really, I mean, this is a very rare opportunity, for us to learn, from you. Yeah, thank you for this presentation, this lecture. And I guess being a moderator, I mean, there's a privilege is to ask the question, just before others. Yeah, but I guess because since we only have very limited time, I mean, I guess before I ask the question, maybe Legge can say something. I'll just keep my questions just for a minute, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Pfister. So I just learned how to say that at lunch. So I'm from the program of China Studies. We have a course, a selective course for undergraduate titled From Sinology to China Studies. So I taught it a few years ago. I adopted a framework in teaching sinology, introducing sinology to our students. That's usually introduced by 3 stages in terms of development of sinology. First stage is the voyage sinology. Second is missionary sinology. And then from 19th century, we have professional sinology. So yeah, I didn't use secular, but I used professional sinology. So marked by the 1814, the creation of the position chair of sinology in the Collège de France. So, and Hermeneutic, who was appointed as the first chair of sinology. So that's the framework adopted. And by learning, hearing from your presentation, your sharing, I think next time if I have a chance to talk about sinology, so maybe I can emphasize more that even what we termed right now as professional sinology from 19th century, we can consider the missionaries, this group of people, as an integral part of sinology. I think that's very important. I did introduce Legge when I talk about sinology in the 19th century, but the rest of the 4 I didn't mention. So I think next time I can include them, and also making sure that it's not as secular as we imagine nowadays. Actually, these people also played a very important part in this what was so-called professional sinology stage in the historiography of sinology. So I have a very small question, and yeah, can I?
Okay, all right.
Among the
Maybe
five sinologists you asked, the first 3, they share, they are very similar in terms of age. So I'm very curious, do they know each other, work together? So that's a small question, but I think it's important for us to understand the network of these missionary scholars. And also, you picked these 5. I don't know whether it's by coincidence. They are from 5 different major European countries. Is this on purpose? You selected them from each country, or just by coincidence, there are 5 prominent ones, but by chance they're from 5 different places. And each of these countries, in my teaching, I introduced French sinology, Russian sinology. So we did that. They are quite different in terms of their own tradition, Italian sinology. So I'm curious why these 5. So maybe we can open the floor and invite all questions, because we are running out of time.
Oh, okay. But anyway, I think you have question already. I'll keep my questions. But I mean, just just a moment later, But for Professor, you want to answer Legge's question?
Actually, let me respond as quickly as I can.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
The reason these 5 came up was only because of what I discovered by searching. It was not arbitrary, but it also was distinctive that these were the only ones in European languages that had done such massive translations. I have not seen any others. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but even in Russian sinology, which is very vast, I didn't see anyone that has all these books, or at least even half of them. Now in Vietnam, Korea, Japan, they exist, but I respectfully decline to deal with that simply because I don't have the linguistic ability. The first question that you had. Yes. The issue is that I think that we set up, we could say, historical periods for the sake of convenience, and that's fine. What happens is that in the 19th century, they overlap. Since 1949, there's no possibility of a genuine missionary scholar who can live like these other people did, because missionaries were pushed out, of contemporary China. It didn't mean they didn't exist, but it's just that then to be a missionary scholar and have the kind of cultural orientation and cultural influences were not there. What is a way also that could be added, though, is look at those that were missionaries and then moved into the university positions. Those are quite important figures.
Moderator, maybe we can. I mean, for Pfister, because really we want to open the floor.
Yes. And
My question, maybe I'll get it. Okay. Or the online or do we?
no, yes, but
And the online audience.
Can I
I don't know
ask a
how many of.
question?
Sure.
Yes, I thank you, Professor Pfister, for this wonderful talk.
I'm not-
I just wonder, among these five missionary scholars, how closely have they kept up with the latest research of the day on these classics, and how often or how original have they ever contributed very original ideas in interpretation of these books?
those are good questions too. And it reminded me that also Professor Lee asked, were they in contact? No. As far as I know, they were not. Zottoli and Couvreur knew of each other through their works, but they never corresponded or anything of that sort. And Legge only became aware of Zottoli late in his career, but he never met him, Now, this is really valuable to ask. The questions of, with James Legge with regard to his account of Shangshu, Wang Tao wrote a paean to him saying he has contributed to contemporary studies of the Shangshu, but he saw him as more conservative, He was conserving a tradition that now in contemporary sinology would say, no, most of the Shangshu is falsified, it was added to, and so it's not something that and so it was different in that way, but Wang Tao saw him as genuinely contributing into that realm. Are the others doing works that were in contemporary sites? Even Legge wasn't comprehensive completely. When he finished his Mengzi, he realized that he missed one of the greatest Qing scholars of the Mengzi, and he said, "I'm almost done, and now I find this." So he wrote about it humbly, which I appreciate. Probably the least engaged with contemporary scholarship, ironically, was Guerra, because he was so much more tied to Legge and Couvreur. But he had studied the text and studied them thoroughly. It was just that he didn't engage the commentarial tradition as intensely as the others. Were there other new contributions in these realms? I have not known of anything stated outside of what I've said with Legge, where the evaluations have come. But what I can say comes from the historian, the 90-year-old historian Liu Jiahe from Beishida, Beijing Shifan Dashi. He said, if we take today these 14 texts and ask how many contemporary Chinese scholars have written contemporary Chinese translations of even half of these texts, he says, I can't even identify one. So sometimes the contribution is not so much one of newness, though Legge did that, I know that, and Wilhelm was very open, especially, what he accomplished with the I Ching was extraordinary, and this is the 100th year of that, the publication of that work, and Professor Lai and others are going to be talking about that in December. Really important, I mean, these are extraordinary acts, More important was that they affected cultural understanding of ancient China in huge realms of academic worlds, in at least 5 different cultures, major cultures, I would say, though Portuguese is not often seen. Brazilian sinologists are growing. They're having an impact, and among them, even online, Dr. Cabral is one of these that is taking a role right now, and I'm very grateful. His book, he has his not only his dissertation but a book coming out on Guerra, and I think it's going to be very important for us all to learn. but it's the impact, the cultural impact of creating a voice for ancient Chinese sources that wouldn't be there for people who didn't know Chinese and hadn't studied those kind of technical texts, you know. This, I think, is the greatest contribution of every single one of them, you know. It's extraordinary, and I have not yet found anyone else who's done such an extensive work, you know, in that regard. You know, if someone else finds them, please tell me. I'm very interested, you know, but I literally, I keep searching. I keep asking, you know, so.
Professor Legge, yeah.
No question, yes.
And that kind of responds to your question. I think sometimes they would like to incorporate some latest European kind of scholarship. For example, Carl Jung's collective unconscious or psychoanalysis into his interpretation of the I Ching or the I Ching to make it relevant or how to say accessible to modern European audience.
Yeah.
So this is somehow a kind of innovative.
Yes, and I would, yes, I was understanding the question to be about late Qing dynasty, for example, or others. But it's true, if you do that, one of the areas that I studied very intensely was James Legge's use of Scottish realism to reveal what was there. Wilhelm used Kant and Goethe, you know, and so they were very, very much working on that that ligature between the late Qing or the China they knew and their contemporary, the most important contemporary cultural figures in their own culture. Yeah, that's another area, you know, very, very important one. Yeah, and I would say, yes, you cannot really understand Guerra's contribution if you don't understand Vatican II. It's extremely important, and he, along with other more radical Jesuits, was open to other religious traditions in ways that many Roman Catholics before had never done, you know. So from that angle, yes, they're even, we could even say that they're outstanding, you know.
Yeah, other question? Yeah, allow 2 more questions. Yeah. Huh?
你自己
Oh, my question. Okay, all right. Oh, me, the last. Yeah, actually, I think I already the question has been asked about the you know, about maybe the so-called scholarship of these translators on, you know, Confucianism, what we call Confucian tradition, or, but you use the term Ruist, right? Ruist. This is very interesting to me, yeah. But I think this question, let's see, maybe I'll just you know, focus on another question, actually, very technical. You know, how did they choose the source text, the classic text for their translation? I mean, that could be the choices could reflect their kind of preferences, you know, their understanding of this Ruist tradition, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the choice of this, you know, text, that's the one question. The second question is about, also technical, is about their, how can I say, the translation principle. I mean, in practice, you know, how did they, you know, maybe accuracy or still maybe some other, like, you know, their understanding, this kind of cultural meanings, you know, for example, the translation of these key terms in Confucian classic, like the Di, 上帝, these are somehow, you know, related to their the Ruist, the theism they claim, yeah. But meanwhile, it's kind of related to like a Christian kind of tradition, right? Interested in, you know, in the traditional China, there's still kind of this Di, Shangdi, similar to like a god. And I think for these translation of these key terms, were there any differences or similarities, you know, among these translators? So just two technical
No,
questions.
no, those are, and
Yeah.
there's actually a third, the use of ruism. I'll do that. Ruism, ruist, ru. The
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
reason I have chosen that is because Confucianism can be confusing. Yeah. And what I mean by that is that some, some they do not have access to Chinese traditions, and they see Confucianism, they think, oh, this is, worshiping Confucius. And is Confucius a god then, or a spirit, or what? Now in the Han Dynasty that did happen, but only for a short period, and it didn't become the trend. So some of us have chosen to do this. I'm not the first one to create this. There were others in Australia, in the US, and Europe that have done it. But now I'm glad to say Paul Kroll, in his very important dictionary, student dictionary for ancient Chinese, he uses consistently with his other colleagues Ruism. Yeah. And we didn't talk about that. I didn't know him before that, but I was really happy to find that he did that, because Ru is the Chinese, the root word, and it, it opens the door toward a broader literati understanding, and not some kind of maybe misguided religious awareness. The standard text, Legge got his standard text from the Siku Chen-chu, and he would take them, because the Siku Chen-chu not only gives its tiyao on interpretations of different commentaries, but also the text and the alternative readings. And so he was referring to that regularly. That's, and this is very, very helpful. It shows that the kind of scholarly level he set for himself. And then these, of course, have gone on. We have now at Chinese University, they've created new digital, texts, where they produce some of these in a variety of different ways, and that's helpful. We have, in some cases, as with the Tao Te Ching, for example, there's some new, very new and very different kinds of texts that have been unearthed in archaeological finds in Guodian and Maowangdui that make this even more complicated, and so, but he did not have those problems, nor did the others. None of them produced these on the basis of something other. I do not have a statement from others that I know about the source text, what was the standard text that they had. I just have a Legge that made it very explicit. I'm sure that they had their justifications, because they were citing them and they were publishing them. So we can follow it by their publication of the Chinese text. No, and the last one, no, my brain. Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, this is a really complex and rich and important issue. It's not only the questions related to deity. For example, let me just indicate some of the problems. Shengren, Sengyan, okay, is a term used in Ru traditions for sage. This is Legge's translation. Wilhelm, early Jesuits, and Guerra translated as saint. Yeah. No, that is really important, because it means you identify the nature of the tradition and its community as something that's holy. And this was one of the reasons why the Jesuit order was rejected in the 18th century, in 1773, because they said, how can you have something holy outside of our divine tradition? Yeah. And the Pope was threatened, but now there's more openness. So here, I take this to be a very important matter, and I discussed it in the last chapter of my book. I get to promote it. Vital post-secular perspectives on Chinese philosophical issues. I deal with the relationship between the sagely and the saintly, and see them as two different kinds of things that need to be considered, maybe even synthetically. But that's one. There are others about, is there sin? Are the sacrifices? Do the sacrifices that may have parallels in Hebrew scriptures, do they have anything that is offered to propitiate the deity, to deal with the anger of the deity? Or is it only as a kind of offering, thanksgiving, and thing? This is an area that became very, very significant, especially, as I mentioned, for Zottoli. He specifically chose the sections of the Legge dealing with the different sacrifices, because for him, the greatest sacrifice was the sacrifice of Jesus, the Christ. And so, is there something parallel? That was a huge area for him. And there's where you see a difference in the hermeneutic orientation. He's very interested in that. And Protestants are, no, it's not a big issue. So there are things of that nature. Many overlaps in terms of the moral character, the development of nobility, the development of creativity. There are many areas of shared wisdom that all of them saw. But the key areas were the question of cosmology and is there a deity? How do you name that deity? How do you distinguish the hierarchies of deities? Because there were pluralities in different texts. And this is why there was a contrast in Legge between the ancient Ru and developed Ru in the Zuozhuan, for example, that had many other spirits and many other problems, and ancestral worship and many other things. Okay. Then you have this question of what is Shengren, and how do you Chengshan? Now that was at the very heart. How do you become a sage? How do you become this wise person? It was at the heart of the Dashui Zhengyong controversy with Juxi, But it's still quite significant that most Christians, including Luo Guang, the bishop, in Taiwan, even though he supports a Juxi reading and tries to integrate Christian spirituality with Juxi's form of becoming a sage, there's most Christians follow more of a Wang Yang tradition and a later Ming Ru tradition, because they say, no, my heart mind, my Xin is what confirms the scriptures. It's not I learn from the scriptures. My very human character is rooted in such feelings of filial piety and concern that they confirm the very truths that these texts make clear. Okay. Hope that's helpful. I would just simply ask, would you please return the